To our planning work session. This afternoon, I'm starting with the mask on and taking it off. We are spaced out differently than usual, with at least 6 feet apart from each of us. And as we move around the building, we're also going to, of course, be wearing masks consistent with our managers, all employees policy when we're in shared space. Wanted just to make that note. And then as I looked through the planning work plan and thought about everything happening for each of us today, I just thought it was mindful that September is a very busy month, and during the midst of difficult, busy days, it's helpful to just keep perspective that there will be a tomorrow, and keep the eye on everybody staying safe and healthy. So with that, I'll just make a couple of points regarding our work session today. First, for our public, and as a reminder for colleagues, we typically do these work sessions in January or February, and this year we did not because of all the COVID-related vaccine response that we were doing in January, February, March. So this is mid-course, this is middle of the year, and we will have another work session at some point, January, February of next year, I expect. Mid-course discussion of our planning work plan. You'll see as you look through and we go through the slides with Mr. Fusarelli leading us through them, that there are a number of efforts that are going to end this year. So as much as ever, this is an opportunity, I think, to be thinking of, I guess I'm thinking in particular, scheduled Pentagon City plan and the Penn Place are scheduled to end late this year, early into next year, which would free up capacity. So as much as ever, this is, in addition to being about adding to the work plan, it's also a little bit hoping that we can have suggestions to take away or allow work to recede into later years when we think that there's a break. So we're very grateful to be here together, and we are looking forward to Mr. Fusarelli in your first large session as our planning director. We're thrilled. Each of us have remarked separately how thrilled we are that you're on board. So we'll first turn it over to the manager to see if, Mark, you have any introductory comments, and then I think rapidly to Mr. Fusarelli. Mr. Mark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the board. I wanted to take a minute to just offer a few thoughts as we begin the work session. You hear a thoughtful and I think balanced presentation from Mr. Fusarelli about the work plan and the challenges we face. And many in our community have debated since the day Arlington was created what our community should look like. Plans have been drawn up, revised, replaced, added to, ignored, embellished, hailed, derided, and debated for thousands of hours. And one constant has been evident throughout, and that is balancing thoughtful and considered planning and the need for action. So over the past 18 months, we've acted quickly to meet the challenges of the pandemic. We have okayed changes to the public realm to allow outdoor seating, different uses of our parking spaces, and different ways of creative use of indoor spaces. And even as the pandemic may begin to loosening its grip, we face a very high commercial vacancy rate of over 19%. We face a landscape fundamentally changed by commuting and work habits and the way meetings and business are conducted. So I want to emphasize this. Please keep this sense of urgency brought about by the pandemic in mind as we look at the changed business landscape and planning landscape. The pace of our economic recovery and resiliency depends on it. So engagement and discussion remain vital, however. And I just would like to note, this is my personal observation, I'm not so sure we're going to have the ability to take 4 years to do another specific plan like Langston Boulevard or 4 Mile Run anytime soon. So the world moves on, and we've shown we can meet those challenges, and we have plenty of challenges ahead. So without further ado, the moment we've all been waiting for, over to you, Mr. Fusarelli.
Thank you, County Manager. Good afternoon to you. Good afternoon to you, Mr. Chair, and to the County Board. Very much looking forward and to today's presentation on the update of the proposed Planning Division work plan. With us this afternoon, it's also good to see the chair and vice chair of the Planning Commission. We also have in the room, and I think also online for support as needed, a collective of additional staff to hopefully address any questions we might be able to tackle after the presentation. So, at a glance, we look forward to engaging you all in the various components included within today's agenda, including a discussion that might help inform near-term updates to the Planning Division proposed work plan. Today's presentation is organized and will be sequenced in three main parts. First, I'd like to share a few thoughts on the overarching framing and formulation of the proposed Planning Division work plan, and then move on to review our portfolio of ongoing projects and responsibilities across the various teams within the division. The presentation will conclude with a proposed classification of projects that depict how we may intend to sequence our future work over time, both in the near and longer term. Before moving forward, I'd like to thank the great work of Jen Smith, Aaron Schreiber, Chris Kreider, and Joanne Harrison, as well as the entire staff, both within the Planning Division and those outside of the Planning Division, who have really done great work and provided great support to put together the materials for consideration and sharing today. In this afternoon's discussion, we are most interested in achieving three specific objectives. In addition to providing a mid-course status update on the Planning Division's slate of ongoing work, we would also like to share our outlook and intentions regarding future work and the potential priorities we see over the next 12 to 18 months. Most importantly, we are seeking county board input and endorsement of the proposed work plan, or, as appropriate, we welcome and would further consider any direction or feedback you may offer regarding modifications to what you hear and see today. With that, let's begin with a few key points regarding the work plan framing and overall approach to formulation. When outlining our meeting objectives a moment ago, I used the phrase, and as did the chair, a mid-course status update to characterize the information we are presenting here today. This framing is based on an acknowledgement that over the past decade, the annual work session discussion has typically occurred in the first quarter of the calendar year, at a time that more directly relates to considerations and actions associated with staffing and budget that occur each April. We understand and appreciate with the global pandemic, we are in atypical times, and if possible, would aspire to the goal of reestablishing conversations on a more regular schedule early in the year. Regarding the formulation of this work plan, I should share that the division had recently initiated some broader, more expansive thinking about how the Planning Division in the future might better and more consistently integrate our core mission with key Arlington priorities and values moving forward. As our core mission, we will certainly need to sustain our core and non-discretionary planning services, complete our major ongoing planning programs, continue working with our partners to progress the Housing Arlington initiative, and address the 5-year review of the comprehensive plan, as well as future planning studies. At the same time, we see real opportunity to more directly link the work associated with our commitment to key Arlington priorities, some of them shown here, such as racial equity and inclusion, economic recovery and resiliency, environmental sustainability and climate change, biophilia, and innovation, modernization, and versatility. So as a starting point, we have begun to incorporate elements of these commitments into the work plan for the coming year, and over the next few years, we will be further progressing our work plan to ensure that the priority areas outlined above are even more foundational, integral, and explicit to the framing and details of future work plans and components. I mentioned racial equity on the previous slide, and would like to take a moment here to just reinforce a few key related points. Moving forward, an important element of how we approach our work will involve applying the racial equity lens to our work from the onset, to shape how we develop our plans and review various projects. For planning overall, centering racial equity in our work means more than simply just looking to engage more broadly with traditionally underrepresented or disenfranchised individuals and groups. While that is an important component, through our work, we must also consider the opportunities for and implications of land use, planning, and policy recommendations and decisions in the future to address racialized outcomes of past decisions. The planning engagements listed on this slide, including the site plan process and projects more broadly, represent efforts where there will be opportunities to directly address systemic inequities in the county's land use and zoning conditions by applying a racial equity lens throughout the entirety of the process and planning efforts. To highlight just a few ongoing engagements, the Missing Middle Housing Study and Multifamily Reinvestment Study in particular present meaningful opportunities to act upon the value of equity in our planning work, in addition to other efforts. With that framing, let's transition to ongoing projects and responsibilities across the planning division. First, I'd like to present the overall organization of the planning division. When at full capacity, the division includes a team of 30 exemplary staff, many of which are situated across our 3 core teams. Under the expert leadership of Manager Aaron Schreiber, the current planning unit comprises planners on the use permit team, as well as the site plan team, with additional leadership of Section Supervisor Matt Pfeiffer, whose work focuses on current development and special use permit applications. Skillfully led by Manager Jennifer Smith, the comprehensive planning team comprises 3 parts, including comprehensive planning, area planning and zoning studies, and amendments. With the additional support of Section Supervisor Kelly Brown, the work of this team primarily focuses on looking further into the future to provide the vision, guidance, and implementation strategies that will allow for development or public investment to help realize our long-range vision for Arlington's future. And in addition, with strong leadership from Chris Kreider, our urban design team provides specialized support to both the current and comprehensive planning teams, as well as other departments, and also manages and maintains its own portfolio of discrete work. As planning director, I work closely with all 3 teams, supported by a core admin team of Joanne Harrison and Giselle Johnson, who also serves as clerk to the Planning Commission. I must say, during my short tenure thus far as planning director, having such an exceptional team of professional staff to work with has certainly helped facilitate a relatively smooth transition into this role, and I look forward to working with all the staff on a daily basis. Before describing ongoing work, I'd like to celebrate and highlight a few notable projects completed by the Planning Division over the past year. We've been busy. The fiscal 21, the County Board approved or adopted 8 major site plan developments, special GLUP studies for Shirlington, as well as the Pershing Drive and Arlington Boulevard area, as well as approved several ordinance amendments, zoning ordinance amendments for various districts across the county. Division staff were also instrumental in managing the review of approximately 100 approved temporary outdoor seating areas, or TOSAs, and formulated administrative guidance for office conversions in partnership with colleagues at Arlington Economic Development. Among other project completion highlights, on the engagement front, Planning Division staff pivoted promptly and effectively to hosting virtual meetings and online engagement in support of the work of the Planning Commission, as well as other advisory groups as well. In terms of current and ongoing work, the current planning team is tracking approximately 10 site plan development applications for major development to reach the Planning Commission and County Board by end of calendar year 2022. And between now and then, we are currently tracking the possibility of up to 15 such applications under review during that time. Keeping pace with typical annual volumes, we're anticipating approximately 200 use permit and minor site plan amendment items for board consideration, as well as approximately 250 administrative change applications over the course of the year. The team looks forward to continuing to work with APS on several school facility use permit projects we expect, and will continue ongoing work in specific areas associated with broader economic resiliency and recovery efforts. The current planning team will continue to provide support for the Site Plan Review Committee of the Planning Commission associated with the review of 4.1 applications. And they will likewise continue with ongoing work integral to their operations and supporting work for projects led by other teams, pursuing updates to core elements of the work plan of the site plan team, such as updates associated with standard site plan conditions and the Administrative Regulation 4.1, to name a few examples. And before moving on from current planning's ongoing work, here at a glance is a list of the approximately 15 site plan applications we anticipate may be under review and or acted on by the county board between now and December of 2022. Approximately half of these are already into the county and have reached at least the preliminary review stage or beyond, while others are anticipated, primarily based on information gained and conversations with prospective applicants. When looking at our long-range planning work, there are currently 7 major studies or planning efforts actively underway, all of which are being led or co-led by the comprehensive planning team, in addition to the Clarendon sector plan update that is being led by Brett Wallace from the urban design team. For now, I will defer speaking to more details on each of these efforts until we see them again in the final section of the presentation. But needless to say, to have this number of ongoing planning efforts and engagements underway at one time with the relative scope of study associated with each truly represents a substantial volume of ongoing work being managed by the division, also requiring time, energy, and resources by other county staff and the community. It's also worth noting that for all of these studies, we work closely with those colleagues in various divisions within CPHD, Parks and Recreation, Environmental Services, and Economic Development. And so many, if not all of these efforts, would also show up on their own individual work programs as well. Collectively, these ongoing efforts, and to which we also plan to begin later this year, command a significant amount of our staff resources, leaving little, if any, capacity to add new work and initiate additional projects at this time. However, on a positive note, and as depicted on this slide, we expect to complete or reach major milestones in more than 6 of these ongoing studies within the next 6 months, and over the next 9 to 10 months, we expect to further complete 3 to 4 more of these studies. The importance of this timeline and outlook cannot be understated, since it's our expectation that as we complete individual projects, only then will we free up staff capacity and resources to initiate new work and address the new next up priorities we've identified at this time. In addition to housing Arlington efforts of the missing middle housing and multifamily reinvestment studies, the Planning Division is also providing ongoing support to other teams that are leading efforts to update countywide policy frameworks associated, for example, with the Public Art Master Plan, Forestry and Natural Resources Plan, and Historic Preservation Master Plan. Furthermore, the team continues to support the pertinent commission and community committees depicted here, which includes the effective transition to virtual meetings, also similarly accomplished by the site plan team, to continue commission proceedings, and will involve continued and future work to transition back to in-person meetings and or hybrid meetings at the appropriate time. On these efforts, we are also very grateful for the ongoing support of our communications and public engagement team that they have provided to ensure the success of these processes. So moving on, in addition to the support or project management role they provide for efforts within the arenas of current and comprehensive planning, the urban design team also has a full slate of ongoing work spread across an array of core service areas. Much of the team's work is focused on components of design review, especially related to supporting the work of current planning staff, managing site plan reviews, as well as managing the review of landscape plans and administrative change requests. In addition, the team is actively involved in many facets of commission, interdepartmental work, and community outreach facilitation. Examples including managing the Public Facilities Review, Design Arlington Awards program, and other public facilitation and focus group coordination, while at the same time providing other forms of support to other teams within the county pertaining to architectural, landscape, and urban design services. And so moving on from that summary of ongoing projects and responsibilities, I'd like to transition us into our final section today, where we collectively take a look at what's ahead. To provide some framing, I'd like to share the 6 main considerations that primarily guided the formulation of the proposed work plan we're sharing with you this afternoon. First is the need to continue and complete the division's non-discretionary core mission services, such as the review of site plan applications and zoning requests, as just 2 examples. Second is the desire and intent to prioritize the effective, timely completion of major long-range planning work already in progress. Third, working with our partners in the Housing Division and others, we remain focused on advancing the Housing Arlington initiative elements in a phased manner. And fourth, we'll get into more of this shortly, is our aim to prioritize starting new work items upon completion of ongoing work. And recognizing for some of these efforts, we will also need to align our interdepartmental and interdivisional staff capacity, scheduling, and coordination, noting that in some instances, the CPHD Planning Division may serve in a leading role, and in others, we may be serving more in a supportive role. And finally, and this will echo a few of my comments from early on, the Planning Division is beginning a multi-year effort to more strategically and directly align future work plans and policies and implementation strategies from comprehensive plan elements and emerging ideas or initiatives arising out of the 5-year review. So from these 6 considerations, we've devised a proposed work plan update that organizes our projects and other work items into the 4 discrete categories depicted here. In terms of current work efforts, these generally include code-mandated, active development and rezoning applications, ongoing long-range planning projects moving towards completion, and sustaining procedural records management and other administrative regulatory improvements. For our upcoming work, we expect these to comprise development and rezoning applications that will be submitted in the near future, as well as the next up long-range planning efforts to address key issues and goals facing the Arlington community. We will also be sharing a few items we've identified as deferred work items, where for a variety of reasons, our position is that these specific potential projects do not currently rise to the level of priority at this time in relative comparison to specific items we've identified under the upcoming work category. And finally, the last category includes those efforts where Planning Division staff are providing more of a continued support role to ongoing and/or future work being led by others. In terms of ongoing work efforts, our current planning team will be focused on continuing to manage the review of development applications, both those involving county board action, as well as those project changes or details that may be administratively approved. The team will also be working to complete efforts to update our standard site plan conditions and collaborate further with our Permit Arlington team on records management enhancements. On the long-range planning side, our teams will continue to balance the 7 active planning processes and/or studies, and one of our main priorities will be achieving the timely completion of each. Several of these studies, such as the Pentagon City PDSP planning study, the Clarendon sector plan update, Crystal City building height study, and Columbia Pike ground floor uses, are all efforts we expect will be nearing or reaching completion within the next 6 months. Several additional efforts listed here, namely Plan Langston Boulevard and the Missing Middle Housing Study, will reach important milestones this fall on the way to proceeding with the next phases of work and analysis for both of these efforts, with both having targeted completions for later in calendar year 2022. Regarding upcoming work items, our team will be ready to meet the challenge of managing the review of future development applications not yet underway, some of which may also include related policy and regulatory updates needed to accomplish specific development proposals. For example, updating block plans for Crystal City associated with CO Crystal City site plan applications where needed. We are also looking to initiate an update to Administrative Regulation 4.1 guiding the review of site plans. In the long-range planning arena, our proposed work plan identifies several next up future work efforts and generally prioritizes 4 of these above others. Specifically, these include addressing the future of outdoor dining in Arlington, which effectively will involve a look at our existing outdoor dining provisions and consider what, if any, changes may be appropriate and beneficial given our experience with temporary outdoor seating areas in response to the COVID pandemic. Before the end of the year, we will also be beginning the online engagement for the Courthouse West Special GLUP study, which will focus on the 2600 block of Wilson Boulevard, and considering a request to change the GLUP associated with a prospective development proposal. Another prioritized work effort is the 5-year review of the comprehensive plan, which we would expect to begin in calendar year 2022. Based on this preliminary thinking, this upcoming review could be conducted in a way that helps to inform the county's approach to manage and support long-term growth, identifies areas where additional policy guidance may be needed to better support future growth through the lenses of infrastructure, societal changes, and geography, and leads to more broadly informed and connected work plans in the future to help address the most pressing planning needs facing Arlington. The 4th priority here relates to a series of zoning studies that have been identified for upcoming commencement, which I'll discuss further in the next few slides. And finally, while not quite considered priorities in the same manner, we do have 2 special GLUP study applications in for Tier 1 review, which we'll be addressing later this fall, and also are looking ahead to engaging on other future elements of Housing Arlington components down the road. In terms of upcoming zoning studies, we've identified 3 specific subject matters that would be the focus of near-term studies to support plans and implementation thereof by other departments and potentially by APS as well. These include potential zoning ordinance amendments for stormwater management improvements, implementation of various components of the public spaces master plan, and what we're calling the modernization of our public zoning districts relating to PS, S3A, and SD. For these efforts, we anticipate there will be leadership from staff in respective partnering departments on the policy and subject area conversations with the community, and that CPHD planning staff will provide support to the effort in the form of land use regulatory, zoning expertise to support the effort. As such, the work plans of other departments and agencies may need to adjust accordingly to ensure capacity to take on these projects. Beyond the 3 previously mentioned slides, our division also maintains a running list of potential future zoning studies that we'd like to address as time and capacity allows. And for this update of the work plan, the approach we've taken is to aim to prioritize the top 3 to 5 zoning studies to undertake in the next year as resources permit. And within this approach, there are several key considerations to note. First, beginning in fiscal 23, we'll be aspiring to focus efforts on addressing several of these unscheduled zoning studies. And to do so, we anticipate likely the need to limit place-based long-range planning efforts to provide appropriate resources to take on a greater volume of zoning studies and ZOA work at one time. As noted earlier, the 5-year review of the comp plan may also assist in identifying policy priorities to focus on that may inform future zoning studies. And finally, we'll look forward to ongoing coordination and collaboration with the zoning division on these fronts and with their lead on various more administrative and technical updates. So within this approach, we've identified here 6 to 7 potential zoning studies we view as strong candidates to consider, depicted in the left-hand column. So after we take up the studies shown on slide 24, if and when we have additional capacity and there's immediate need for attention on these items, we would give further consideration before then in terms of the exact sequencing on which studies to commence at that time. And as you can see, several of these items relate to commercial market resiliency, housing affordability, sustainability requirements for the form-based code, and emerging trends tied to the changing face of retail and online fulfillment services. And after upcoming work efforts, we've identified a series of potential studies or planning efforts that at this time we are proposing to defer for a future moment. We'll briefly discuss each in a bit more detail. So in the context of our work plan, at this time, we are not recommending to prioritize the study of the February-Lothrop property. I think I skipped 2 slides. Excuse me one moment. Regarding the February-Lothrop property, in April 2021, the County Board directed staff to scope a possible planning study to consider how county goals could be achieved across the subject property. Staff has been drafting a preliminary scope, and I'd like to highlight details of our current thinking to date. For the potential study, we'd envision the main purpose as developing alternative land use vision scenario and recommendations for other county goals, such as recreation and public space, more attainable home ownership or committed affordable housing, historic preservation, and sustainability, including energy efficient design, tree preservation, and conservation. If this study were undertaken, we'd envision a phased process that in total might require approximately 6 to 8 months. So in the context of our full work plan, at this time, we are not recommending to prioritize this study. However, if an applicant elects to pursue a change to the land use vision or pursue more intensive development, we'd certainly revisit this approach at that time. In arriving at this recommendation, we've considered several factors, including an understanding that the ownership and associated parties are intent on pursuing the easiest path to sale and development, that significant levels of increased density or either county or third-party interest in the property may likely be needed to make significant gains in some of the aforementioned goals, and that absent a specific study for this site, the missing middle housing study presents an opportunity for outcomes from that effort to further inform what could potentially happen here at this property. We also expect challenges with the ability to initiate this process in short order if required, without suspending other ongoing work items at this time. Earlier this year, there have also been discussions about potentially developing policy guidance for requests involving temporary conversions of residential units to hotel. As part of the overall work plan discussions, we are proposing to keep this item on the work plan as an unscheduled potential study for further analysis and policy considerations. What this might mean is that in the meantime, staff would only consider supporting requests for portions of new residential buildings for temporary hotel use for up to 24 months, as has been supported by previous board approvals dating back to 2016. We would target initiating this work in the next couple of years should there be continued market interest in this business model. And to wrap up this section, just a few brief notes regarding the proposal to defer future work on long-range planning for public facilities and foreign RV implementation. On public facilities, Arlington County and APS are continuing to engage and enhance our coordination related to land use planning and public schools planning and staying on top of impacts of development on potential student generation. Also, we see the opportunity for the 5-year review to further inform potential next steps and future prioritization of this effort. In terms of foreign RV, the existing zoning and GLUP conditions are not seen as major impediments to potential and desired change there, and early intentions were for arts and industry study work to precede other land use and zoning efforts. Also, we are seeing implementation moving forward, such as with phase 1 construction of Jenny Dean Park and other improvements to ped bike connections involving the 4-mile run trail through that vicinity. And finally, just shown here, the division continues to support other various planning efforts being led by other departments and teams across the county, and will continue to ensure we have the resources on hand to provide the appropriate level of support going forward. And so that concludes my overview of the proposed Planning Division work plan update for this afternoon's session. We have prepared a number of discussion questions that we can certainly come back to at the appropriate time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fusarelli. Really appreciate the discussion questions and the thorough report. And I was looking at the organizational chart and thinking, my goodness, I thought there was legion more of team members. And so everyone clearly has been and is busy. Thank you. The driver for this, of course, is our Planning Commission, in addition to our Planning Division leadership. And we have with us the chair, Mr. Lantelmi, and I believe you may have some prepared remarks. And we also have our vice chair, Mr. Weir. And we'll start with Mr. Lantelmi. Go ahead.
Thank you, Chair Deferred and County Board members. I'm happy to be here live. And as mentioned with me today is our Vice Chair, Daniel Weir. First, I want to thank you for reinstating the work session. I think this is valuable communication between our commission and the board. It's another step back to normal. This afternoon, I'll be giving you some planning matters that we believe that the county board should be thinking about going forward and eventually making their way into the work plans of both CPHD and maybe other departments of the county. But first, I want to thank you and staff for the past year and a half for the support we've gotten on the Planning Commission, that we've been able to continue our work through all of this effectively and give you the recommendations that you need in order to be able to do your jobs. I was really gratified that Arlington's workload didn't drop through this, that we're still an attractive place for people to live in, to come and build in, and our workload reflects that. And I think that's all to the good, and it tells a lot about what we're doing here and what we have been doing here. So thank you very much. The first topic I want to cover is zoning, one particular thing. We've been seeing some very small site plan projects come before us, small lots with 2 dwelling units that are in our districts. This is happening because our land values continue to increase and we still have an acute lack of housing. Many of our district neighborhoods have non-conforming duplexes, triplexes, low-rise multifamily buildings. And they also have a lot of lots that are smaller than are otherwise permitted within our zoning, so they're non-conforming. They're there. They've been there for decades. They're not going away. So we're going to be, I'm assuming we're going to be seeing more of these small things come before us. We think we really need to deal with this. It's not, it's just, it's a waste of all of our time. It's a waste of your time. It's a waste of the Planning Commission's time. It's a waste of staff's time. As Mr. Fusarelli has shown, we have a huge amount of work, consequential work. To have a site plan for one duplex in our neighborhood, there's no value added by doing that. It's not appropriate. And in fact, it's contrary to what our comprehensive plan is advocating for affordable housing, for housing period, and for equity. These small lots, when the zoning rules were created and those lots were made non-conforming, we have seen how a lot of those lots tend to fall in our historically African-American communities. This is something we learned a few years ago when we went ahead and successfully modified our rules for modifying houses that were in those non-conforming lots, that they didn't have to go through, they could be done by right. I mean, adding a dormer could be done by right. You probably remember that. We need to expand that to cover just dealing with these houses that are on those lots now, that they just, if they are non-conforming in some way, like they're encroaching on sides or whatever, go through BZA. The way, if it was a McMansion, it would go through BZA. We asked the question and the answer was, on one of these small sites, take a single household building with the exact same dimensions of the house that's the duplex being proposed, would that come through site plan? The answer was no. It would go through BZA. So you have to go through more time, expense, and uncertainty in order to have a duplex, which is what we want in these areas. So I would recommend adding this, throwing that into the hopper as yet another area that we really, it would save us time, money, and staff resources if we could get this addressed. see, clearly those type of houses have not been detrimental to those neighborhoods, given they've been there since before zoning was created, or that type of zoning, and housing prices continue to increase, property values continue to increase. They are not a problem for our neighborhoods. And I'm hoping when we do have missing middle further, we'll confirm these things. Now, some of these could be addressed by missing middle, but I think a lot of them, these issues won't be, and we might have to have a second track for that. One minor thing, I've been saying single family. I think this is something we need to change and start referring to single family as single household. We have a lot of the literature, there seems to be a consensus that's growing that the term single household is really more properly encompasses what we're talking about here. And certainly within Arlington, it's a broader concept that really better embraces all the people that live in Arlington now. Moving on, a second thing, uses. And this did come up, a couple of things that Mr. Fusarelli has raised. We should be looking at the permitted uses throughout our zoning ordinance. For example, in C districts, we have many underused below-grade parking structures. It's worth looking into what other uses those spaces could have. Can we be creative and think about how we could use that, what is now totally wasted space? Could we put server farms there, capture some of those? As Mr. Fusarelli mentioned, maybe last mile fulfillment centers, could they be used? That would be a win-win for everybody, for the property owner, for the county as a whole, and for the people it serves. It can increase our tax receipts all around. I think that would be a good thing for us to do. Another thing for uses, now that we've had an explosion of work from home, that will most likely continue to a certain extent past COVID, we should be looking into what work is in fact permitted under our zoning ordinance. You know, we have uses that are allowed, and we have some uses that are not allowed in our districts, for example. I would imagine there are people doing work from home now that have no idea that what they're doing may not be complying with the zoning ordinance. And I'm not sure that what they're doing there really is a problem for those neighborhoods. So we should sort of do a quick review of our zoning ordinance to see, are there things we can change quickly to basically legalize what people are already doing? Outreach is something we've already talked about a number of times. Of course, fully representative public participation for land use matters is a perennial problem. Getting everybody that we want to have participate is not easy. Over the past year and a half of virtual meetings, we've experimented with new formats, and for many of our meetings with a lot of success. We've been seeing new faces, we've seen more faces. The demographics haven't particularly changed, and that's one of the things we need to figure out. How do we get more people in, different people in? And this is, again, another equity issue. We would strongly recommend, of course, allowing us to continue with virtual and hybrid meetings. We have to find ways to make sure that that, in fact, happens, because it is working. It's certainly better than what we had been doing before, and that was one of the good things that came out of this, having these experiments. I also understand the county's redoing its website. If it is, I really strongly urge that the planning websites be included in that and be redone. I always am very frustrated to use them, and I know somebody who's new to planning or has not been involved in anything before, it's not easy to find stuff. It is really pretty clunky. I mean, it's there, but you have to dig, you have to look for it, and it's here, there, everywhere. It's not intuitive. And if we are going to be redoing our websites, please include the commissions. It will make it, again, this will make it easier for participants by people who are not usually brought into these things. Especially as we're moving more and more of our processes online, it's going to be really critical that our websites reflect that and make it easy to be online. Another outreach area that I think we can get some quick improvements on is our physical notices. You know, right now we have those cards, 8.5 by 11, that we nail up on telephone poles. You've probably seen those in your neighborhoods as you walk around. They're really not good enough. I'm one of those people that does actually read them, but they're in legalese. They're done to comply with the code, but other than that, they really don't give good information. Look at Toronto. Toronto has this really good way to do it. They have these huge signs that they put on in front of sites that are in full color, that are readable, that actually give honest-to-God information, and they're fun to look at. We could do something like that, and that's fairly low-hanging fruit, I would think. Right now, I'm going to take a little bit of break and turn it over to Vice Chair Weir here to go through sector plan updates, and I think we certainly, to a certain extent, with the county manager. I will be back after he is done.
Thank you, Chair. And tell me, Mr. Weir.
Thank you. As I pull up my notes, I apologize for being underdressed today. Unfortunately, one of the victims of the pandemic was my beloved blue blazer that I lost to some of our six-legged friends. And I also managed to add about an inch to my neckline over the pandemic. So, Mr. Chair, members of the County Board, Mr. Fusarelli, Mr. Schwartz, I want to begin by echoing Chair Lantelmi's gratitude for all of the work that's been done by you and by people who are on your teams over the past 19 months. And I'm glad to be here in person, and I very much look forward to the time that more of my and Chair Lantelmi's colleagues on the Planning Commission can join us in person again comfortably here, as has been the case in the past. I'm mindful of the comments made by Mr. Schwartz at the beginning of this session that we don't have many opportunities for four-year planning efforts. We seem to be fresh out. I agree that we don't have those opportunities. And part of the reason that we don't is because that there's a trend toward things developing very quickly. Even aspects of of recent sector plans, like the updated Crystal City plan, are becoming outdated. And I think that, and my colleague and many of my colleagues and Chair Lantelmi think that it might be time to more aggressively adopt approaches similar to what has been happening in Clarendon or Pentagon City, where we take a more agile approach to updating sector plans and area plans. One frequent punching bag in the county, of course, is the Paulston sector plan, which is older than a growing share of the members of at least the Planning Commission and many others. Paulston's planning needs today have become very different than the planning needs that it faced in 1980. Future development in Paulston is much more likely to look like Paulston Exchange or Paulston Quarter than the Waycroft. But the Waycroft does highlight the kind of problems that Paulston will face going forward, i.e. Glebe Road continues to become more and more of a wall that separates East Paulston from West Paulston, which are increasingly becoming, to some effect, two separate communities. And it separates them because pedestrians and people not in cars are unwilling to cross between 5 and 7 lanes of traffic for the sole purpose of going across the street to get a very excellent donut, or to go to one of the many restaurants that have been circulating through some of the bays there. So, how we plan Paulston increasingly must take the form of asking, how do we better sew together the two sides of the street, than asking what is the appropriate massing as the buildings in Paulston begin to rise above 5 stories, right? That ship is, we've stepped off of one ship and onto the other. The good news is that that those kinds of questions can be approached with more granularity and more nimbly than looking at full-scale sector plan updates. And so I am here at the table before I turn the floor back over to Chair Lantelmi to suggest that staff and that the board and that commissions consider using Paulston as a test case for looking at sector plans and asking what are the problems that exist today, and how can we break this work up to prepare planning guidance that will help us solve those problems. Paulston's problem today, its biggest problem, is very likely Glebe Road, in part because we used Glebe Road as the border 40 years ago between Central Paulston and West Paulston. how we look at lines on a map, how we draw lines on a map shapes how we think about the problems and questions that are before us. And so one thing that I think should be considered is to begin not by the question of how do we redo the sector plan, right? But begin by thinking, are the sub-areas within the Paulston sector plan that were set up and established 40 years ago, are they appropriate for the problems and questions that we have today? Perhaps Central Paulston doesn't need to be Liberty Plaza and the surrounding confines, but perhaps Central Paulston should be Glebe Road and the block on either side of it, which is increasingly the spine of that neighborhood. A more agile and nimble approach to the question of how do we plan Paulston going forward would be not to redo a sector plan that was designed for how do we get to 20-story buildings, but how do we approach development and change in Paulston in such a way that will more ably weave together the two sides of this street. It's not a process that needs to be completed in 2022. But it is an opportunity that we can and should start thinking about, especially since, if done right, could increasingly be a model for more agile sector planning going forward. And so that is my portion, and I am pleased to cede the floor back to my colleague. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Weir and Mr. Lantelmi. I think we're now ready for questions. You go ahead.
A couple
Go
more
ahead,
things
Mr.
that I
Chair.
wanted to cover, and then if you will indulge me, that you'd
Sure.
like to bring to your attention. And these will be quick. One, parking. It was raised by Mr. Fusarelli. Providing parking by developers is expensive. It's time to look into all of our parking requirements and move away from parking minimums and move toward parking maximums. Planning and transportation. I'm a member of both the Planning Commission and the Transportation Commission, and I see how these areas are intimately related. Planning shouldn't really stop at the right-of-way. The planning staff will naturally have insight into how our comprehensive plan speaks to what goes on inside the right-of-way. There should be more coordination and communication between CPHD and DES, which will benefit everybody. Schools planning. In late 2019, the JFAC began with CPHD and Arlington Public Schools a master planning process for schools and public facilities. That effort was not surprisingly sidelined when the pandemic hit. We believe that work really should resume. School planning is coming up in questions and comments in almost all the public engagements that I have been with, in the Pentagon City PDSB review and the Plan Langston Boulevard community meetings. And it will no doubt be raising its head in the missing middle process whenever we have public forums. The reasons that the county started that 2019 process are still valid. So it really is time to restart it. I think that having APS coordinate with these will help make them successful processes, especially Plan Langston Boulevard. It is coming up a lot. It will come up with missing middle. If we really want to make that a successful effort, schools have to be involved in that. When we said missing middle, can we change the name? When I've had community meetings or talked with community members and they hear the term missing middle, there's not been a single person who is not involved with planning who understands what it means. They all have, to a person, thought it means affordable housing, low-income housing. No one understands that it means form and how it would fit in with the existing residential neighborhoods. No one, not a single person, has gotten that. We really have to be looking at marketing for this better. And finally, biophilia. It's a fairly new concept, but it is something that we have certainly embraced. It is still emerging. We do raise it at all of our site plan meetings and our planning commission meetings. We're still feeling our way along as to what quite it is and how to apply it to our various projects, but we are doing that. We do have people on the planning commission who are championing it, which has been very, very good and very gratified about that. We have some examples for that. The Ames Center building in Roslyn. One of the reasons we're excited about it is that they came to us with very very clear biophilic elements within it. Green balconies and the like. The new pass-through, the new corridor. All of those worked really well, and it was a big part of the discussion. I think that was quite successful. Another thing is, I think Board Member Libby raised, Board Member Garvey raised, we have a lot of fallow land around here. I think as part of Biophilia, would be doing a quick inventory of what is there. Do we have any rare plants? What sort of animals are living there? What sort of nests are there? Can we deal with that? How do they fit into the surrounding area? That's biophilic. We'd want to be able to show, maybe a checklist that is it here, isn't it here? How do we deal with this? Should we deal with it? These are all, I think this all gets pulled into the biophilic concepts that we're emerging and will be pursued and developed further as the years go on. That is something that either it will happen organically through our various studies that we're doing within CPHD, or maybe we'll have to do something more targeted for that. But I think that is part of the larger concept that we are doing. Anyway, thank you. Those are the topics I wanted to raise today, and thank you for your patience. And I guess now, any questions for Commissioner Weir or me?
Sure. So thank you, and I did not mean to jump in early. We all wanted to hear your full report and thoughts. It's also great to hear a number of good ideas, both from you and Mr. Weir. That is new ideas that have energy behind them don't always happen every day, and so that's really great to hear. So we'll go around with colleagues for questions. We both will have some questions, I think, for discussion for Mr. Fusarelli, as well as the Planning Commission and you, Chair Lintelmi. So I'll start off with one for clarification, just for you, Mr. Fusarelli, which is slide 16 talks about, I guess I just was hoping that it might be possible to get a little bit of an update. One of the areas that was prioritized to keep as far as work was the Courthouse West Special GLUP study and that work. I didn't know if you had maybe an update, or your team might have a little bit of an update on sort of the timing of that. I know there's a fair bit of work that's involved in that, but just wanted to see it's prioritized, but it's looking out towards the end of next year. And so I didn't know if you could provide any context for the work that would be coming through with the Courthouse West Special GLUP study. I think it's also referenced in as a priority on slide 23.
Certainly, and I will attempt to provide, I think, a current status update on that, and I think Jennifer Smith can sort of signal if she would have more information to share. But I believe our current conversations with the applicant have indicated we will be planning to again begin online engagement for that effort before the end of calendar year 21. And so I think perhaps in the December timeframe, and we would anticipate engagement through the Long Range Planning Committee in first and second quarter of next year. And I think we are currently targeting completion really before or by early summer of 2022. And so I think that hopefully provides an update to that project.
That's very helpful. And I think that there's sort of the question of density at stations and the question of sort of leading up towards stations or density, some density in applications at individual sites. So it sounds as though we're into the block type development in addition to the special GLUP study. And that was kind of, I didn't know if the first question of sort of our planning approach had yet been addressed, and it may not have.
Just for clarification, for that study in particular?
Well, I guess there's the saddle approach of higher at metros in general. Is that still, it's a little detailed, I apologize, but is that still our approach, or have we not quite gotten there?
No, I think it's a great question, and I think that will be part of sort of at the heart of this study, right? Is we understand that the applicant has a certain, scale and sort of form of development in mind, and we, working with the LRPC, will evaluate, how those approximate forms or levels of development may or may not be appropriate for its context. And so that will be a big focus of the study, and we'd be looking forward to reporting back, early next year.
Perfect, thank you. I'll yield. I don't know if folks have, Mr. Dorsey, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I got a lot of questions after this robust conversation, so I'm going to have to prioritize on the fly. I want to start off with Mr. Fusarelli, and just to get your thoughts as to how we and you are going to integrate the planning division with the broader and more specified and presumably over time increased goals towards energy efficiency that we're articulating in the CEP, how we're going to marry that with land use evaluation and incentives and zoning. I don't really know how we're going to proceed with it, but I'm wondering if you have any early thoughts about how you might sort of tackle that.
No, thank you for those really, really big questions. I think perhaps as recently as last week, we were discussing with colleagues in environmental services, I know Mr. Emanuel's here, in terms of some ongoing planning work that their team is either planning to initiate or currently working on. I think some common topics of conversation that have, we've faced collectively as challenges, especially with development applications coming forward in terms of, electrification of buildings or EV charging and other issues. So I think part of it is continuing to collaborate with our colleagues in environmental services, see where there's planning efforts and where they arrive at and how we might tie those back into how we review development, in addition to, other facets of sustainability. So I think appreciate, the question. I think it's a really big one, and something that we're going to continue to, to work to address. And I don't know if Greg or others would have anything to add at this point.
I would say simply that Anthony hit on the big one with the electrification, transportation. Then we're going to form a specific work group just on that because it has implications on public spaces, on private spaces, in the right of way you name. And then Mr. Dorsey, your guidance on the board at budget adoption for FY22 also kind of asked us, we bring forth the budget guidance as you propose it, that do we look at the whole of government approach? So we will try to wrap all those things together as best we can.
Terrific. Thank you both. And if I could just follow up briefly with something on this, Mr. Fusarelli, and I'm not saying this just because we're in a public forum, but one of the great innovations in CPHD and the planning division was your accepting a role to, I can't remember what it was officially, but it was to, basically solve a lot of sticky issues and to, really be deployed for things that would come up that were not on schedule and needed to be worked out for various reasons. And you were quite effective with that. And as you think about many of the suggestions that came from the Planning Commission, many of which intrigue me, really, they're not going to fit within the whole structure of, do you assign a planner the ability to work on this for a number of months and everything else. So I guess the short question is, any plans to replicate the model where we get more of you throughout the division? Because we're now charging you with this broader responsibility, yet it seems losing the ability to deploy someone uniquely skilled to tackle a lot of these sticky issues.
Appreciate that as well. I think part of it may be perhaps broader conversations with our leadership within CPHD and Director Williamson, but I think one of the points that your comment and question hit on is, is there a way in which we can approach, like take, for example, some of the zoning studies that were, in the presentation, and I think some of the other points that Planning Commission Chair Lentelmi spoke to. Are there certain ones of those studies that we could potentially focus in on and perhaps without too many months of time, appropriately and adequately study those issues and bring something back for action, rather than having a more kind of protracted process. And so that's one area of exploration. I think I'd like to continue to work with, Jen Smith in particular and Aaron and others on, exploring what possibilities we may have there to really make some progress that we've been, just collectively, I think, challenged with, right? Our list of zoning studies in particular continues to grow. And if we're going to take on a number of place-based studies all at one time, it really limits our ability to take care of some of the other, important regulatory work as well.
Thank you, Mr. Dorsey. I think Ms. Crystal and then Ms. Carvey.
To pick up exactly where Mr. Dorsey left off, I think these are what our former colleague, Mr. Gutschall, used to describe as low overhead zoning ordinance amendments. And I actually think they are a matter of not just allocating staff time, but they're a matter of the trust and political capital that we extend to the community as the board and planning commission and LRPC, and that the community in turn extends to us and the planning staff. And by that I mean, what makes these processes lengthy is, of course, the high degree of community engagement on which we've prided ourselves in Arlington, notwithstanding the needs to continue to iterate and upgrade and become considerably more inclusive in those processes, as Mr. Lantelmi spoke. But I think we found, and one of them was non-conforming duplexes and the amendments we made a couple years ago. Another great example was community pools. We knew that there was an opportunity, we hoped anyway at the time, to realize a very public serving need in Green Valley for a community pool, and our zoning ordinance was the major obstacle to doing that. We got in the habit with those couple of examples of saying, essentially, as the board, that if we take shortcuts, so to speak, this is a compelling enough community need that we will have staff's back if that process moves forward more quickly, maybe not quite as fulsomely, because there is really compelling community interest. And so I think that was a really good habit to get into, not just because it was a more effective or efficient way for staff to use its time, although I think it was, but because it represented a real recognition on the part of the board and I think the Planning Commission about sometimes the trade-offs between meeting these more urgent community priorities and our more extensive studies. And so I really hope we can continue with that model, that we can name it for what it is, that the board can look for ways to support that in the Planning Commission and so forth. And hopefully when we reconvene maybe in February of this upcoming year, as some of these longer range studies are coming off the plate, as they wind down, we can think about how to just kind of create a column in the work plan for the low overhead zoning ordinance amendments and keep exercising that muscle. One other, I'm going to see if I can squeeze in one other question. Like Mr. Dorsey, I have many, so I'll do one more if that's all right, and then yield the floor. I really appreciated Mr. Lantelmi's point about the non-conforming duplexes and triplexes taking up a lot of Planning Commission time. I know they've taken up a lot of staff time. We see them, sometimes they end up on our consent agenda, sometimes they end up on our regular agenda, and I think that is exactly the right way to be thinking, which is where can we put some work on the front end to save ourselves a lot of work on the back end. And so I wanted to ask, this may be something that staff just needs to noodle on and come back to us, but I know that substantively these non-conforming issues are not the same exactly as missing middle, which is to say that the zoning ordinance amendments ultimately that allow us to codify some of the recommendations that may be forthcoming from missing middle would not be the same ones that would be needed to tackle here. But it strikes me that the public engagement and the conversations may be very similar. And so do we think there is an opportunity, at risk of, I don't want the missing middle housing study to kind of groan under its own weight, right? We're already tackling a lot. And if anything, we're looking for ways to streamline in the next phase. But, is there a place for some of these conversations so that when it comes time to hopefully do what Mr. Lantelmi has suggested, which is figure out ways that there might be a more administrative approval routed through the BZA for variances or otherwise, we don't have to duplicate all of the public engagement and input that we've gotten throughout the missing middle process. The codification may take some extra steps, but the dialogue has already happened. I don't know if that resonates at all, and again, it may be something that needs further thinking, but I really agree very much with this spirit of the concern and wonder if that could be a path for resolution.
Certainly. No, Ms. Crystal, I appreciate the comments, and I think just to pick up a little bit on some of the earlier comments from Chair Lantelmi, I think as staff is getting close to ready to releasing kind of the phase 1 report for the missing middle housing study, and soon to commence all the analysis that will go into phase 2, I think part of that conversation, just within the context of missing middle, will need to take into consideration, if there are other housing typologies that we want to carry forward and, are determined to be potentially appropriate, what does the implementation or entitlement processes for those look like? There may very well be or may not be kind of linkages back to the issues that you and Mr. Lantelmi have raised. So perhaps, for purposes of today, allow staff to kind of take that back as we, get ready to engage in the next phase of missing middle, at least sort of pull this into part of our thinking and consider whether or not there are some efficiencies gained in how we're thinking about the one initiative compared with the other, I think, challenge that I think we would agree with, right? It is not just a big drain and draw on planning commission and community time, but, staff, we have to allocate staff to lead and manage the review of duplex site plans and similar projects. And, is that sort of the best way forward?
I think that's great. And, it's all sort of animated by a spirit of, if we're asking people what their reactions are to duplexes in their neighborhood, right? Like, can we smuggle in some thoughts about non-conforming duplexes and maintaining that use or expanding that use, as well as innovating the zoning ordinance? So I really appreciate that and the willingness to think further. Thank you.
Thank you. On that, I have full support for finding a streamlined way to move forward. And I'll be interested also, I'm not sure that it's easy for BZA is not meant to be sort of broader policy related. So I'll be interested in whatever solutions we can bring on that. That's very much of interest. Ms. Garvey.
Yeah, thank you. So this meeting is really making me feel, boy, is your job starting to change? I mean, you can just feel it. It's just new issues, and it's moving fast. It's a real challenge, which I don't think my question isn't going to help with. So one of the overall issues, we start out, which is great, the equity issue, and that's so important because we're trying to infuse that in everything we do. The other issue, though, that I think it's here, but maybe needs to be a little more clear on how it infuses everything, is the whole climate change biophilia. So, and I'm not sure I don't even have a suggestion for you on exactly how to handle it, because I think we are in part. So there's the energy question that Mr. Dorsey brought up, right? And we've got an office that works on that. But pretty much every building we have now, large ones, we've got people come in and they want it all. They want it electric because they want everything electric. They don't want anything to be natural gas, and they're pushing, and you've got people upset about the birds hitting the glass. And I have this sense sometimes that our requirements, that we have, the standards that we set, are kind of like lagging by a lot. And that gets down to the speed thing. And the same thing, the question, and this one maybe could be solved easily, and that's the issue of this inventory. And actually, thank you, Mr. Lantelmi, for bringing it. I actually have not discussed it with my colleagues, so this is sort of new to them. But Elizabeth Gearing came to me and talked with me about particularly the Amazon site, which is basically an undeveloped site, and there are a lot of plants in there and critters in there. It's certainly in the middle of an urban area, but it's a site that has a lot of natural life. And she's saying, do we have any idea what's there? And I don't think we do. And I think it's Alonzo Abogada has been to some other sites and checked things, and she was suggesting, could he go to this site? I talked to the manager about it. I'm not going to get out of the line of authority here and get confused about what my job is. But I think if we perhaps could have an overall look that when we have these sorts of sites, maybe there's just a checklist that just is done regularly. I mean, it feels like that ought to be kind of institutionalized and a little bit, so that's a simple thing with a checklist, but if there's a way to sort of institutionalize the look at the effect on the environment, so that, it's stormwater, it's everything. I think it's done, but it's not so clear because it just seems, a little bit scattered, and when people come again to talk to us, we kind of get the same concerns and upset each time, except people are a little more upset each time they come because they don't see things happening. So you're at least nodding your head. This has been kind of, not a very organized set of comments, but I'm trying to just sort of portray what I see as a large issue, and I'm not sure how we should address it.
No, I mean, thank you, Ms. Garvey, and I think you covered a lot of ground there. And I think there are ongoing efforts by staff on, various components of that, right? I think one of the challenges is that over time, especially in a lot of our high-density mixed-use development areas, those sites, have not, historically been sort of natural sites, right? I mean, Arlington has this history of sort of converting single-story commercial or surface parking lots to something else. And even with the, I think, site you were speaking of in Pentagon City, like actively today, it's a concrete batching plant operations. And there are some, edge areas where maybe warrant further exploration. But one of the takeaways I'm gathering from is sort of the maybe desire or want to kind of connect and better sort of, draw some linkages across some of these various components. And what I come back to, and whether or not, at the end of the day, it will address it fully, is sort of our intention to undertake the 5-year review of the comp plan and to try and use that process to perhaps identify, some priority areas for maybe, where there's room for improvement or advancement that would really hit some of these cross-cutting or multidisciplinary, I think, questions or challenges. So that's an area I think we're going to continue to explore and, see what the scope of that could potentially focus on.
Thank you. I'll have some more questions on that, but I'll yield the floor for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Garvey. Mr. Karantonis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Truly a lot to discuss. We could stay here for a long, but I'm not. I will try to just formulate two first reactions on the environmental sustainability goals. I literally think that among everything that was already mentioned, I would add net zero buildings. The buildings that we're building today or modifying today will be critical for us achieving any goals in 2035 or 2050. So I see, and at the same time, we're at a crossroads where Arlington will have in its corridors, Richmond corridor, Pentagon City, et cetera, an enormous addition of new build. And I think that it will be a colossal failure if we don't deliver there structures that are future-proof, that we'll be able to defend further down. A second thing, and this is a general note on the organigram. So we care about urban design. I really care a lot about urban design. There is, see that you reaffirmed your commitment to have the urban design group supporting, reporting directly to planning director. We used to have also an architect, not only planners, but also an architect. I said that we are seeing a lot of new buildings coming in. All these buildings will represent an epoch, an era. And like it happened to us. The buildings of the 70s represented an era, an epoch, and we've seen how fast they aged and how not great they aged, making it really very difficult today to deal with these buildings. So what is our commitment, or what is the department's commitment to form?
Thank you for that question. And you're right. And I think there, if I'm not mistaken, and my leadership team could sort of correct me if needed, but I think within the past several years, there have been some sort of organizational changes within the planning division, and the role of the county architect, I think, has sort of been incorporated into Chris Kreider's role. And so in his capacity, he's sort of serving dual duty, so to speak. But I think the question about our commitment to form, I think, is a good one. I think one of the things that I'm excited about in transitioning into this role is to really continue to advocate for and try to champion sort of the highest level of quality and design in terms of built environment. And I think that continuing to explore opportunities for additional resources to allow Chris and the rest of his team to more effectively and just have more ability to support all the site plan development activity that current planning is managing, as well as additional support that the long-range planning, that the comprehensive planning team could benefit from, is something personally that I'm interested in exploring to see how we can grow that potentially. And that might be a more appropriate conversation, perhaps, early next year. But I think a lot of our urban design and long-range planning efforts are focused on trying to get the form right as we continue to accommodate the appropriate levels of development within areas of the county.
Thank you. That's good. I'm continuing to be interested in how we can excel on this. I will.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Carantonis. Mr. Fucirelli, so my question is actually incorporating Vice Chair Weir's questions about Glebe Road and using a test case, using a pilot to see if we can address the need to update the Paulston sector plan with sort of a working, sort of a work action group. Kind of like Mr. Dorsey was referring that you've done some. I don't know if you have any thoughts, or it's fair to just say, want to pause, think about it, and come back to us, but that's certainly of interest to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think the comments echo a fair amount of what we heard. We had the opportunity to bring a preliminary version of this draft to the Long Range Planning Committee back in late July, and so there was some amount of discussion focused on Paulston and the age of its sector plan. But I think one of the interesting components of that conversation was a discussion about going forward, how can we think about and approach updates to our various plans? And I think this has been an ongoing conversation for several years now. I think, it's something I think we would want to take back, and we've started to have very preliminary discussions internally about what that might mean. And I think, as was referenced, the current work that we're doing in Clarendon to update some of the guidance from the 2006 plan there, as well as the work to revisit aspects of the Crystal City building heights. Those are two examples and potential models to learn from as we might focus in on some other geographies within the county. So certainly more work and thought in those directions, but just some preliminary responses for now.
Great, that's helpful. I'm sure. Go ahead, Ms. Garvey.
Yeah, thank you.
This one.
Back to the 5-year review of the comprehensive plan, and this question may be for both you and the manager. A couple questions. One, the comprehensive plan has got a whole lot of parts in it with a whole lot of priorities. How are you thinking to structure prioritizing the priorities? Because that's going to be part of what you'll need to be doing. And is 5 years too long? That's a long time, considering we're all talking about how, to do that kind of work. I know you need a lot of time, but I'm a little worried about 5 years from now, things will have changed a whole lot.
Certainly. So I might try with one aspect, and I may turn to Jen Smith to see if she might want to take the first part of your question in a little more detail. But I think the good news is that the 5-year review, that's actually not the amount of time that it takes us or that we're budgeting to complete the review. It's actually, we're required.
You do it every 5 years. I misunderstood.
We're required
that's
every
fine.
5 years to
Yep.
update it. And so that's one piece of it. And on your first piece, I may ask Jen to speak a little bit more to some of the thinking that she and her team have had to date very early on regarding this effort.
Thank you for the question. And normally what we do, again, mandated by the state, that we look at the comprehensive plan at least every 5 years. We do a body of work that really accounts for what we have accomplished in the past 5 years. And in prior years, we would look to a forecast ahead of what is coming down the road. And most of that was just insulated primarily on the planning division. There were years that we were looking, broadly around the county. I think what we are looking at this year is how does our comprehensive plan, certainly through 11 elements, and some of which have been updated very recently, but how do we showcase that? How do we really inform the community about some of our 21st century emerging priorities? How do we want to think about those moving forward? The question of how do we do these studies? How do we remain nimble? Those are a couple of the few things that sound very broad sitting here today, but those are some things that we're aspiring to make this year's 5-year review that we're actually late on. So we need to endeavor to complete this work next year. But we are trying to do it more than just an accounting of what has occurred in the past. And how do we sum up, in a way, what the 11 elements reflect? You know, do they cover all of our emerging priorities, values, and how can we portray that in a meaningful update?
That's great. And then how do you plan to, I guess elicit from, I would assume you could get the board in, I mean, what are our emerging values and our priorities that we want to do? That feels to me like board, I mean, I'm not criticizing you at all. That's I think, kind of our job. In a way, how do you plan to sort of, are you planning to include the board in some of this? I think you see a little bit where I'm headed.
Yeah. If I may also ask Jen to speak to that too. Sure. Perhaps provide a little bit of context for how we've approached the engagement in the past or in previous 5-year review efforts.
Well, we certainly would prepare a scope of work to really figure out how we would accomplish this, and we would be certainly, and a lot of that needs to pull in our partners from other departments as well. We've got so much information already documented. So some of this may not be creating as much new, but how do we communicate? But certainly checking in, talking with the manager's office, with the board members on what that scope is and how do we do engagement. That's what we have in front of us.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll just say to my colleagues, I mean, I feel we're in such a time of transition, and, just like the two major things we've been talking about here, in a way, equity and the environment, and then, of course, there's the housing and those issues. So those are two priorities. I guess they're equal, but I'm not sure, and we have some other major priorities. I'm just thinking it might be useful to find a way, if there's a way of doing it fairly efficiently, for us to have a fairly good conversation as a board, which I think will make the staff's job a little easier, because I think staff has to guess, okay, so they've got maybe 3 major priorities, which is the top one, which, they have to work that through. And it feels like that's something that we ought to be kind of providing guidance for as leaders in the community. I'm not quite sure how to do that, but there's some really big issues out there, and we are sort of, I think, rapidly changing our sense of what is really a priority. And I think that's a good thing. But I feel like we need to be a little more intentional and specific, clear about what it is that we want to do. And that's not just for you. Obviously, I'm talking to my colleagues and folks, and we'll see if there's some way to do that. But I think looking at where the kind of transitions we're going through, I'm feeling the need for a really good understanding of what are our top priorities, what are our goals, and helping staff to then help us get there. So thank you. Thanks. Yeah. Thank you, Jen.
Thank you, Ms. Garvey. And I think it would help me because if I'm not mistaken, the statute just requires, it's one sentence, if I remember the requirement for a comprehensive plan update every 5 years. And so, but we have a history of doing much more. So I think it could be helpful. That's aligned with the prioritization, but there's a communicate function and there's a lot of pieces going. So I do think short conversations with each of us and then some clear thinking from us could be helpful as you approach that. But Mr. Dorsey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So moving to the work plan itself, generally, the deferred work efforts for next year, I find, acceptable and understandable with one exception, and that is the 4-mile run area implementation. So before I cast a negative tone on this work session, I'd love to hear a little bit more about why that is, why that meets the criteria, or why you all have included it on the list to defer. And let's just say in a public forum, all of these are important initiatives and ones that if resources permitted, we would love to be able to get to, but priorities have to be made. So if you can just share a little bit more of your thinking about why that was deprioritized in the upcoming year.
Absolutely. Thank you for asking about it. I think in some of our recent interdepartmental conversations, because the 4-mile run valley implementation was, I think, probably was also identified in last year's work program as something for unscheduled future work. So I think some of the things we pointed to is that earlier conversations following on the adoption of the area plan had identified sort of the arts and industry study work to kind of precede some of the other efforts related to any changes that might come about related to the general land use plan and zoning. And I think sort of related to that point, I think from staff's perspective, we have not to date necessarily identified elements of the existing zoning and general land use plan that have sort of stood in the way of potential changes that might be sort of desired or pursued there. And then at the same time, just recognizing implementation of some of the other county investments and projects. Again, to your earlier point, if we had the resources, everything would get done. But sort of on balance in the context of other possibilities, this is, that hopefully provides some additional perspective in terms of why we situated it where we did.
Yeah, I understand that, and it's probably, maybe something that I'll discuss with colleagues over time about how we might rethink the resource issue to maybe see that this moves forward more quickly. I understand that AED is taking a lead role in, wherever we stand with determining what are preferred models that we would try and implement there, but I can't imagine any scenario where it doesn't include some significant work on an overlay district and new incentives to actually make something happen, as opposed to just being a vision for the arts that's all fluff in concept and doesn't really have any tools to implement. So, I, for one, don't believe that we should continue to allow the 4 Mile Run area to wait while we tackle other priorities. I think it's well within us to actually put on paper the kind of tools that can make an arts district come to life down there. And it seems to me the longer we wait, the more expensive it gets, the more difficult it gets. And we should really strike while the iron is hot. So I'll work on that. Just want to give you a preview that is to come at some point.
Great, thank you, Mr. Dorsey. Certainly the space that is going to be available for the stage that we took action on in the last 3 or 4 months is one of the areas that I feel like that was a good outcome, but that's not sufficient. So I do want to get to colleagues. I also don't want to just have this be with want to bring in Mr. Lentelmi. If you have any comments, just either you or Mr. Weir on what we've been discussing to this point. And so you can be thinking of that. I don't want to just put you on the spot. If you have ideas now, go for it. Maybe we'll go to Ms. Crystal and then to you guys to see if you have any thoughts on what we've lifted up to this point.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I'm just riding in Mr. Dorsey's slipstream today. I agree, and I actually think to even put a finer point on it, with regard to 4 Mile Run in the Arts and Industry District, I think there is some danger, and having been involved in sort of the abortive attempt to get that planning off the ground, can see it. There's sort of this sense that there's some risk where the expectation is by Arts and Industry District we mean exclusively government investment in arts. And we know that that's actually a sustainable way to create arts and culture in general, right, let alone in a district. And so I do worry also, as Mr. Dorsey said, not only are we missing opportunities if we don't have a strong planning muscle there, but that we're sort of giving credence to the idea, which creates an expectation we'll never be able to fulfill, that any arts and culture footprint there is solely going to come from public dollar investment. So well put, it's always much easier to say why the things we've deprioritized matter than identify something that's been prioritized, but I'll join you in that sort of hard look. Similarly, with regard to the kind of deprioritized piece, I understand the thinking absolutely on the residential to hotel conversions. Of course, the urgency there is that we are probably going to see more of these proposals. I appreciated the recommendation here and that you would be deferring this with the understanding that staff would consider requests only for up to 24 months for such conversions, and that expectation is up to 24 months with no opportunity for renewals.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fair question. At the risk of sort of making a statement or taking a position this afternoon, because there may be the other sort of complicating factor there is there may be other forms of conversion that we may see, either on a temporary or even a permanent basis. Okay. And so I think what we've seen to date is there's been an evolution of a certain model that then has sort of been expanded and grown over a series of years, and to the point where it started to raise these important policy questions. So I think we would have to take that back and maybe further consider, would the expectation just be the 24 months with no real potential for or extension? So we can certainly take that back.
I appreciate that, and, speaking in bright lines means that there's always going to be something that comes across the transom, right, where the bright lines don't quite apply, so I understand and respect that caution. I mean, of course, you've heard us probably belabor it at this point from the dais, right? Our discomfort is that we are backing into making a policy through a series of one-offs. It would give me some comfort to know that there is no intent to bring forward a proposal to exceed 24 months. I think that's consistent with what we've done to date. It would make me considerably less comfortable to know we might be seeing more of these on the dais, with sort of the implication that there could be renewals and extensions. Because if we aren't able to get our arms around this at a more comprehensive policy level, which is of course the first preference, want to make sure that we're not unwittingly doing it for all of the reasons we've articulated, right? The concerns about taking units out of the filtering process for affordability, et cetera. The only other question I had about deprioritized pieces, can you tell me a little more practically what it means for something to be in the second tier? Does that mean, it's likely to come at the end of calendar 2022? Does that mean, realistically in December 2022, we're talking about whether that happens in 2023? Like, help me understand what second tier means.
So if, I presume
I'm
you're
looking at
speaking to the
26.
zoning, slide 26, the zoning, yeah. So I mean, I would actually go so far as to maybe not ascribe specific timeframes with those. I think it's really more so if we had to put the various potential specific zoning studies within two buckets, the first tier would be those like in addition to or beyond the three efforts that we had identified, we would be working closely with Parks and Recreation, Environmental Services on in terms of stormwater implementation, public district modernization, and implementation of the PSMP. Beyond that, as resources permit, I think those items in the first tier would probably be, we'd probably be selecting from that column over the next 12 to 18 months. I would just reinforce, I think one of the points I tried to make in the presentation is it's probably some of those first tier studies, notwithstanding the comments earlier or questions earlier about are there low hanging fruit, or are there specific zoning studies which upon closer examination we believe we actually could get there more quickly and get it done more quickly. But putting that aside momentarily, we expect to probably have to complete some of our major place-based planning efforts and sort of not begin any major new ones in order to really make a dent in both the first tier and then the second tier. So I know that probably doesn't answer kind of with the specificity on timeframe you were looking for, but hopefully it conceptually explains the approach.
It does, and as we talked, you characterized it well. We are having an off-cycle discussion of the work program, so I'll tee this up maybe then for something that I will be especially interested to talk about again when we revisit this conversation in February. Surprising no one, the child care initiative. I would like, I've watched that sort of get relegated to the second tier or down the priority list since the child care initiative work plan in 2018 identified some really meaty areas of work where I think we can be making a meaningful difference in expanding the supply of child care. And one of those, of course, is the idea of density exclusions or bonus density for child care uses on the first floor if the applicant is willing to commit in some way to affordable rent for that child care center. I think if of the few lessons that everyone agrees on from the pandemic, it's that childcare is as essential to our economy as anything else, and that it continues to be in short supply. And we're lucky to have laid the blueprint to tackle that back in 2018, but now we've got to actually do the thing. So happy to table that for February and can maybe do my pressing then about ensuring that is a first tier priority for Arlington rather than second. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Crystal. Was Mr. Lantelmi or Mr. Weir, did you have anything that you wanted to interject? Want to make sure?
Actually, no, I think it's been a great discussion, and I think you've identified quite a number of very good comments on those things. So I have really nothing to add at this point, other than something I'm embarrassed to say I forgot to mention. I do want to highlight that you have a very strong planning commission. The colleagues that I've been working with are we work well together. Even our disagreements are useful disagreements because it helps us think through our recommendations to you. So it's, I've been very impressed with and gratified with all of the commissioners' nimbleness in moving to the new environment that we're in right now, and continue to be effective, continue to work, and take the work very seriously. Everybody really wants to make sure we're giving you the best advice and the best advice for this community as a whole. And people do take that broad view. They definitely do take the view of this is a larger community, and they don't just advocate for one little area here or there. And I think that's very important for you to know that I'm seeing that, and that you know that that is how it comes out. So anyway, thanks for indulging me on that.
Sure. Well, good commission is led by a good chair. Thank you very much. I did see Mr. Weir had a hand and wanted to offer a thought or two. And so maybe we can just switch chairs.
I should let Chair Lantelmi's gracious comments be the last word, but I'm not going to. I want to thank, one thing that there are a lot of things I want to thank Mr. Fucirelli for including, but one thing in particular on this slide 26 was the inclusion of potentially redefining family in the ZO. I do hope that will move to the left instead of to the right over time. I think it's incredibly important. There is an emerging policy consensus, at least in legal academia. There's an article that I will happily, law review article I'll happily share with you by Sarah Bronin, who's a law prof and architect and a former planning commissioning chair in Hartford, Connecticut, on alternative models to the definition of family under the functional family alternative, but I think also makes a compelling case that the use of family as defined is not just exclusionary from a policy perspective, but of questionable constitutionality anyway. So I do hope that that's something that moves forward, and I just want to echo your inclusion of that as well as Chair Lantelmi's inclusion of it. And so again, I hate to follow up such a gracious comment with, it's not minutia, but a small comment. And that's my only specific comment. So thank you again. Thank you all.
Thank you, Mr. Weir. Mr. Karantonis.
Thank you. Two things. One, following Mr. Dorsey's and Mrs. Crystal's remarks, especially Mrs. Crystal's, the issue of adaptive reuse of existing buildings. This is, to me, you have it already. We're talking about office conversions, right? But it's not only that. Mr. Lantelmi talked about the need to think about schools, to think about these things. And adaptive reuse is a tool, is definitely an instrument. And it helps when we can have a more comprehensive understanding of where we're heading towards. I do understand that this is more of a discussion that we should have when we are discussing the 5-year review of the comprehensive plan. The long-range planning for public facilities, not only myself, but a lot of people have the impression that this is kicked down the road all the time because we're so busy with everything else. So that's number one. Number two is the issue of, with the excellent compendia to the missing middle study, we had some clear understanding of, for example, how many oversized home conversions we have. So more than 10% of our entire single household stock is already, replaced by form that is 3 to 4 times bigger in size than what the pre-existing condition. And this is going very fast. This means every single, working day we approve one, more or less, right? So, and to me, this is an important. There must be a tipping point somewhere where the form, the character, the neighborhoods begin to change significantly. We see that in a very, very overheated market right now, and the pandemic was of no help because it has even accelerated and exacerbated that. So, where does this fit in the work plan?
I mean, just to clarify on the second point, right, and where does the question of adaptive reuse fit in? I'm just trying to, were those two?
Adaptive reuse also for public facilities, not only for residential. And the second is what we do with McMatchin. So,
Right. Well, so I mean, I think, you know, in terms of the second, in terms of the missing middle housing study, that initiative is, you know, squarely focused on this question of, you know, we know what our current regulations and what the market is allowing for in many instances today. And the question is, you know, do we want to allow for other types or promote other types of housing inventory and options other than just let the status quo continue, right? So to me, I think that's a fundamental question that are at the heart of our ongoing missing middle housing study work, which, you know, we're continuing to advance into the next phase. I mean, in terms of adaptive reuse, I think that's, we and our partners in economic development have had a lot of conversations around that, both feeding into and then coming out of the recently developed administrative guidance for, you know, for conversions, right? And so in some instances, there may be a lot of challenges to adaptive reuse of buildings, but we know that there are certain instances where, you know, they are a viable solution. And so continuing to explore those options, I think the administrative guidance helps with that, but we can further explore, resources and time permitting, are there other steps we could be taking? You know, some of the conversations we've had to date, you know, can we go back into the zoning? And if we adjust some things in the zoning, will there open up options that don't currently exist today to backfill some existing space that may be vacant and may remain vacant if we don't maybe think about our regulations a little bit differently? So both good questions and, you know, focus of our ongoing efforts.
thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Carvey.
Yeah, thank you. Let's see, I guess I'll start with Mr. Lantelme. I completely agree with you on the Planning Commission. Thank you. You know, I've been observing the Planning Commission for almost a decade now, and obviously from a distance, but this just seems like an extraordinarily, really collaborative, really hardworking group, and I really appreciate the work. I also will mention here, we don't want to go into it here, I'm sure, your suggestion of changing the name of Missing Middle is maybe not a bad one. I'll just say, you know, as we're trying to connect with people, and there's a lot of upset. I mean, maybe as we get into the phase 2 of this, it might be a possibility we somehow, somewhat rename it, because you do have to keep explaining to people what it means, and that's always problematic, so I'll toss that out. And then I'll return to slide 26 in the second tier list, which is what we're all talking about, right? And first, I'll say I totally support Ms. Crystal's, you know, support on the child care and what you can, and I know you're continuing to look at that. I have often said, I thought if we actually did an overall look at priorities in this county, you know, we've got equity, we've got climate change, I think child care would be right up there if you actually really looked at its effect on the community, on our families, and actually on our economic viability. I think it would rise a lot higher if we kind of did that sort of overall look. But be that as may, I'll just weigh in right now that I do support that. And then I'd just like to bring up the accessory dwelling unit review, and I'm not going to pull up the pictures. I know I've sent you all some pictures from one of the houses, and it just felt, looking at these pictures, like that's not what we meant. And it's a detached unit. Is there a way, so the second tier, you've got the review for the whole thing. Can you pull out, would it be possible to pull out just a small section like the detached ones, or maybe just the detached ones on non-conforming lots, and take a look at those sooner rather than later? Is that a way you can move forward on that a little bit? And maybe I'm off base. Maybe nobody else is concerned about this particular issue, but I'm feeling pretty uncomfortable with it.
Well, I mean, so to be frank, I actually probably need to get a little bit more up to speed on educated on the specific intent of the scope. I might turn to Jen, but we may need to kind of come back and I think there's more room for kind of the potential scope of that component and whether or not it had to do with considering the allowance of additional dwellings in other locations beyond or other districts beyond where it's currently located. But if there are other kind of elements or specific facets of the current provisions that, you know, are perhaps worth revisiting, you know, we can at least consider that as part of our future scoping.
Well, maybe it'll be some offline discussions with people. To me, that particular unit, it just seemed higher and closer and more overwhelming to the neighborhood than we actually had sort of intended. And I don't know exactly what all the reasons are. And then maybe I just am sort of isolated in my view on that one. But I will follow up offline. I'll be happy to talk to my colleagues about it and talk to staff. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Carvey. Ms. Crystal seems ready.
I was just going to say, having engaged in some of those conversations with Ms. Garvey, I think perhaps the right next step is to share. I know you have shared some of those examples with staff. I think we've been pretty fortunate. A number of these accessory dwellings, interior and exterior, have been built since we adopted. And I think we've been pretty fortunate. We've heard very few complaints about them. I think we've seen one pretty egregious example, right? And so I think what could be a really helpful step is to just ask for some professional insight on, how a house could, an accessory unit could be technically conforming, although on a non-conforming lot, but technically in agreement or alignment with the regulations, but sort of have the effect on its neighbors that it's having. And then from there, right, maybe there is some small adjustment that could be made within the accessory dwelling, exterior accessory dwellings on a particular kind of lot. Maybe the answer is that it actually reopens a really tough question about the allowable heights of accessory dwellings, which, again, I'm put in mind of something that Mr. Gutschall used to always say about single-family lot development, which is anything you allow the sweet little old lady to do, you have to allow the big bad developer to do. And in this case, I will not be so gauche as to weigh in on his age, but I do recall we had a really wonderful resident who passionately wanted to convert a garage into an accessory dwelling, and the height was what kept him from doing that. And so that was one story I really had top of mind when we adopted the ordinance amendments. And now we have maybe an example of, I won't characterize anybody as a big bad developer, but maybe a more sort of perspective type construction that has taken advantage of that same allowance. So, I think the real question is there a tweak that can be made to prevent a specific example like the one happening right now in Douglas Park that does not implicate big structural conversations about something like height that's going to cut both ways? If the answer is yes, I hope it's something we could do with alacrity. And if the answer is no, maybe it is a bigger conversation that has to happen as part of the 5-year review, for example, that I know is on the horizon of that accessory dwelling.
So thank you. Ms. Crystal just completely restated exactly what I meant to say. I'm not nearly as eloquent, but that's what I would like. Yes, no, exactly. Yeah, I mean, is it an outlier? And if it is, we just need to deal with that so we don't get more of them. I don't think it's a big bad developer. I think people are all kind of well-meaning. It just didn't work out like the way I think it probably should have.
So it feels like to me that there might be a follow-up conversation or meeting that could happen just so that you guys connect on that issue. So I actually wanted mindful of time, but did want to try and answer the questions on page 33. And I'm going to endeavor to see if there's one of the items that is recommended that I would like to know more as to whether I think it should stay in there, and that's the public district modernization ZOAs. And I just think that the bulk of that work may have come before I was on the board. And I'd love a little bit of understanding. I'm mindful of your comments, Mr. Lentelme, on the planning with respect to capacity in our schools. But I guess I'd just love to understand a little bit what that work is, and if it is pressing time-wise, given the return to schools, but still we'll find out the September 30th numbers, but still likely to be 1,000 students less. And so I just want to understand that work a little better.
Certainly, and I may say an opening remark, and I may turn to Jen Smith a little bit to provide more detail. I think that to your question, though, I don't think the focus is so much, at least in my understanding, based on the conversations to date, focused on APS so much as it relates to perhaps prospective county use of land, and how can we best fit or meet our facility needs in a zoning district that is many, many years old and may not be sort of as flexible or as malleable to both allow for some of our facility needs and at the same time ensure that those uses are appropriately kind of situated and mitigated within their context. So it maybe have more of a county focus, perhaps with some APS relation, but I'd ask Jen to see if she has any
maybe
details to add.
Ms. Smith, you can help me too.
Thanks. Anthony Fusarelli, he had that correct. In 2016, we did some amendments that really helped facilitate growth for APS, allowing their facilities to have some additional flexibility in the zoning. And as you know, there have been some facilities that have come to the county board, and you've approved some, again, additional flexibility with regards to height or placement. And that's one piece that had been contemplated and has been envisioned that we would consider that for county facilities as well. But I think being able to look whether it is just giving flexibility to look at the standards, but any opportunity to think about newer standards, whether those are uses or dimensional standards or other components. So still some additional work that we would need to scope out, but how do those public zoning districts really meet our direction and our needs in the future, which ties back again to us looking at the comprehensive plan and how can some of that work lead us into those sorts of zoning studies.
Got it. Thank you. That's helpful. I see Mr. Emanuel nodding. And so there may be, I think I need to understand a little bit more, I guess, on a relative basis when I think of even starting the work on Tier 1 on the affordable housing ordinance, and perhaps, frankly, the child care piece. Those are candidates for me to be switched out in terms of time. But I want to reemphasize that I could use some background and education on that, and so I could be persuaded. I certainly am still thinking about our discussion regarding land trust and Freebreed Lothrop, but I just don't think good ideas sometimes are not good enough ideas for time-wise, and I'm pretty sure that colleagues probably agree, and I think you made a good presentation on that. So that's just wanted to try and offer thoughts on the plan, try to answer the question as Mr. Dorsey did so early so well. So I think we've come to the end. I'll try and pull out a few items that, as we sort of summarize, that seem like potential action steps. I'm sure colleagues and Mr. Fusarelli, we will follow up after this meeting. But for me, trying to get specific thoughts on duplexes that are non-conforming is something that I'm interested in and would love to hear more about. I think several colleagues have mentioned climate change. There's both the sustainability planning piece, but also transit-oriented development counting as part of climate. We have such a history of that, but that's an area that I'd be interested in following up, and certainly also, at least from my own perspective, the Paulston pilot type piece that Mr. Weir mentioned, and then perhaps more simply, short conversations as you work towards the comprehensive plan with board members seem to me worthwhile, of a half hour or an hour. Those are a few thoughts, but none. I also, without objection from Ms. Crystal and Mr. Dorsey, I know that you guys have some follow-up that you want to do on the 4-mile run and the child care, and I kind of took it as a conclusion that you would come to board members on that rather than adding to the large bucket of work, first board members and then staff. So, but we can't really conclude better than you started, Mr. Lentelme, with a thank you to the planning commissioners, but also our staff who's working so hard. Thank you for all your work. Ms. Flanagan-Watson has a new leadership role that includes this over some period of time, and just grateful for that. Mr. Emanuel, Ms. Smith, Mr. Kreider, Mr. Beach, and Mr. Schreiber, I know I'm gaining a sense of how hard you are working on a regular basis. I think I speak for the board where we are very, very thankful. It is on a community-wide basis both true that we have a challenge with the 19% commercial vacancy rate, but we also do have projects, and we do have development, and we are in a moment where Arlington's strengths continue to pull people here, and you really only need to go outside the door to see the change that's happening, that we have an attractive economic place for people to be in. So we'll be eager to continue the work. We have, I know, Ms. Crystal, having made sure we did this, apologies for vaccines dominating January through May, But I do know that we'll come back in February, and I'm confident of that. So with that, thank you, Mr. Fusarelli, Mr. Manager, colleagues, and we are adjourned.